This is a video interview played out for the court on the 9th of March 2023. The interview is with Mr. Abraham. The detective begins questioning Mr. Abraham about what happened on August the 22nd. Mr. Abraham says, "We came out from watching the match. We walked up King's Heath. We've got past the first house and I heard a bang. I thought it was fireworks. Both of us have ran. He's fell over. I don't even know when he got shot. He just fell to the floor. As he's rolled over, I've jumped over him. I opened the gate and ran. As I've looked back, I saw Joseph carrying on up the street. Someone with a gun was walking down the road. I thought he was going to come up the entry to me, so I've started doing the back gardens fearing for my life. I've come out on Finch Lane." "What time did the match start?" says the detective. Mr. Abraham says about 8 p.m. The detective says, "You have mentioned Joey. Who is Joey? How often do you hang around with him?" "I just went to my mate's to watch the match on my own accord." The detective says to him, "Where does your mate live?" Mr. Abraham does not want to say. Mr. Abraham says, "I think I got there about 6. I went the off licence and got a few cans to watch the match with." He says that he went to Tesco Express on Princess Drive, and this was around 6 p.m. Nee was not there when he arrived at Mr. Naylor's house. The detective asks, "Who else was there?" Mr. Abraham says, "Don't want to mention no names, love. There were a few of us there, like. I don't really want to say anything about them." He asked how long his arrival was after Nee turned up. Mr. Abraham says, "I couldn't even say, love." The detective continues to ask further questions about the timing of the match. Mr. Abraham says, "I think it finished about 10 to or 5 to 10 p.m. "What happened then?" says the detective. Mr. Abraham says, "We just walked out. We got to the corner and that's what happened. Someone was shooting at us." The detective says, "Can you do me the area where your mate lives so we can figure out the route?" "Literally, just right there, on Finch Lane." The detective asks who he was walking with, the direction, and who else was there. Mr. Abraham says, "Just me and Joseph. It was quiet at the streets, to tell you the truth. There's a pub over the road, Dovecot Labour Club. We call it the Bunker because it's got no windows in." The detective asks, "What's the next thing that happens as you walk?" Mr. Abraham says, "I just heard a bang and that was it." The detective asks, "Where did the bang come from, like behind me?" Mr. Abraham says, "Literally, really close." The detective says, "What happens next?" "We started running, then there was another bang. I basically ran into the garden and through the entry." The detective says, "Did you or Joey say anything?" Mr. Abraham said he was saying, "Please don't." I heard him saying, "Please don't." "You say Joey stumbled. What did he do?" Mr. Abraham said he just rolled over once, then back up and carried on running down the street. The detective asked which house Mr. Abraham ran to. Mr. Abraham says it was like 1, 2, 4th or 5th house. He says, "I've gone through that gate and up the entry. I've gone through the back, I've opened a back door and just ran through the end of the garden and over a fence, then over another fence and back onto Finch Lane." The detective asks, "Those houses on King's Heath, their back gardens back onto Finch Lane, right?" Mr. Abraham agrees. The detective asks him to clarify which garden he ran into. He says, I can't, it was pitch black. He says, as I look back, he just carried on walking straight past the entry. He had a bubble jacket on, like a rab or something. I couldn't see a face or anything like that. I just saw his hands out. I couldn't even see what was in his hands, to tell you the truth. I just automatically thought it was a gun, but I couldn't see what was in his hands. He says the coat was like a thin bubble one and dark in colour with a hood. He says it was pitch black. All I could see was the side of him. I just remember seeing that coat. Mr. Abraham says Nee ran straight up the road on Kings Heath Avenue towards KFC. It's a big long road, you see. He's ran straight up. I'm sure it was 2 bangs. I'm sure it was. I'm sure it was 2. I heard like all people shouting what's coming out the windows and opening and stuff. I was running for my life basically. Mr. Abraham is asked if he saw anything out in the street. He said the match had just finished and there was traffic coming. I just started to get away. As far as possible basically. Mr. Abraham is asked, what's the plan? I was going to the chippy and going straight home. The detective says, do you know if Joey has any issues with the problem? And Mr. Abraham says, no, not that I can think of, no. Since it's happened, has anybody else talked to you, says the detective. I spoke to no one. I've kept away. All I've seen is what's happening with the news and stuff, says Mr. Abraham. Just going back to the first person in the rab coat. Can you tell me what his footwear was? How tall was he? About my size, says Mr. Abraham. What build was he? Says the detective. I don't know, says Mr. Abraham. Was he like skinny or like a big build? Says the detective. I can only see the side of him. He was just walking basically, yeah. After a brief pause as the detective speaks to a colleague, the detective returns. Mr. Abraham is asked about the route he's taken at the time of the shooting. Mr. Abraham says, I don't want to get myself into trouble neither. The detective explains they need to know where Mr. Abraham and Mr. Nee have been shot at. Mr. Abraham says it was on the corner. How many bangs have you heard? Says the detective. 2 or 3. Then I'm sure there was another 2. There was definitely another 2 when I was in the back garden. At this point, the detective asks about his phone number and the video interview is concluded. This is video interview 1. Next up will be video interview 2. The trial continues.